Hi everybody. Have you ever wondered how a puppet like me is made? Well, watch this film and you'll find out. See you later.
The first thing you've got to do when you're making a glove puppet is decide on a subject. I've chosen a friend of mine called Dennis. I've drawn Dennis many times in cartoons, so I'm fairly familiar with his face. However, working in pen and ink is quite different from working in plasticine. Working in plasticine, you've got to consider the three-dimensional aspects, the way the nose sticks out of the head, the way the waves in the hair have to be simplified into great lumps. I used plasticine as a young boy, but I was always aware that I never seemed to have enough of it when you bought a little packet. As you'll see, the plasticine I'm using has got a kind of marbled effect through it. This is because it's just odd bits and pieces of different colours that I've used, because it's the form of the face I'm interested in at the moment, and the colour will come later on when I paint it. It would take about between an hour and 2 hours, depending on the head, to complete the whole plasticine model. And as you can see, we're starting to get a fairly recognisable outline of the face here. The finished model itself, with its exaggerated features, doesn't have to be smooth and perfect. You'll see there are many bumps and flaws on the surface of this, but the next stage we're going to do involves covering it all with paper mache. And so even if it were done really fine and smooth, the paper mache would cover up any subtle detail. The next stage involves covering the head with Vaseline. This is to prevent the paper mache from sticking to the plasticine head. Although the plasticine has some oil in it, if we didn't put on a coat of Vaseline, when we tried to remove the paper mache coating, you'd find some of it stuck to the head. We're now ready to apply the paper mache, and you'll see it's just regular strips of newspaper which we cover with wallpaper paste. I also put a little bit of PVA in the wallpaper paste just to strengthen it. Paper is then torn into small strips, and you're better to tear the paper so it's got a fractured rough edge rather than to cut it with scissors. It makes it more obvious where the joins are if it's got a completely straight edge. At this point I'm going to use a little tool just to gently press the paper mache into the crevices of the face. You never get as much detail on the paper mache as you do on the original model. The next stage is going to involve varnishing the head. This just seals all of the paper mache under a coat of waterproof varnish. Now, using a really sharp scalpel, we've got to cut down the edge of the head right at the highest point, and then turning it to the back, we slice down the back of the head too, right the way down to the neck, and then once again down the other side. And this is where, if we've Vaselined it properly, the paper mache will not stick to the plasticine. So with a little luck, as we gently prise it apart, we should get the head to come off the plasticine quite cleanly. So far so good. We turn it to the front, and this is always the most tricky part because you've got the most detail there, the eyebrows, eyelashes, lips. There's always a little bit of damage when you take it off. Some bits will tear slightly around the edges, and you just have to live with that. We'll patch this up with a little bit more paper mache once we put the different parts of the face together again. So there we go. We've taken the skin off the plasticine, and what you can do at this stage is you could patch up the plasticine quite easily if you wanted to go through the whole process again and do a second head for some reason. We're now ready to start putting the head back together. I use a glue gun for this. I don't want to use a wet type glue in case it softens the paper mache and ruins the shapes that I've so carefully created. So I'm using a hot glue gun. I find this is by far the best thing. However, a word of caution. A hot glue gun can give you a really nasty burn if you get the glue on your fingers, and I've had many a blister from pressing a piece of paper with hot glue underneath it only to find the glue spill out the sides and fuse with my skin. So if you are using one, please be very, very careful. At this stage I always think it's a bit like a kind of Easter egg that you're putting back together. I like the contrast between the coated brown outer surface and all of the newspaper articles that you can still see inside. And it's nice working with it because it's so light now, of course. You've been used to handling the heavy plasticine, and this thing weighs nothing because it's such a thin skin of paper that it's formed with. These little tabs of paper go from one piece to the other, and they can abridge them together and create little keys of strength to hold the mass together. You still got the big nasty lines down the sides where the join can be seen, and the next stage is to cover them up. So we're back to a little bit more paper mache, and we've coated the paper, and we're now going to address all of those seams and cover them up. So once again we're back to tearing little bits off it and applying them to the surface. It always seems to be one step forward and half a step back at this stage, but we're getting near to the exciting part for me, which is when I get to paint the thing, and you can really let colour do so much for you. However, here we have the paper mache applied. All of the seams are now sealed and covered up underneath the chin there, and we are now ready to give it a base coat of colour. Of course, we've got to give them something to wear, and at this stage, while the paint's drying on the head, I'll often mark out the material for his shirt. I've made up a little pattern myself which accommodates my hand, and once the material's put together with pins, and I find I never throw out an old shirt now because there's always something there to be used, it's ready to be sewn together, and you can see it's got room for the arms. Right, so now we've got our coated head, and we can compare it to the plasticine head now, which I've kept for the time being, and you can see you don't get the same depth of detail on the paper mache head, but when I paint it, I can paint shadows into it, and we've got the benefit of colour, the contrast of the rich black hair and the pale flesh colour. So you do get a chance to enhance the look of your puppet in a way you can't do with the plasticine. So having applied the black coat, it still looks fairly ordinary, I think. It's only when we start to put in the flesh colours and shadows that it really comes alive. You can see the grim expression I've chosen to put on his face here. This angry look is really enhanced by the colours that you've applied. It looks a wee bit like bad stage makeup, all the exaggerated shadows. Now we're ready to put on his little shirt, and as you can see, I've sewn it up, and lying at the side there's a little collar. So the shirt gets pulled on at the front with his little button at the neck, and the collar will be applied separately. And there he is, all put together, and with just little bits of movement, it's amazing how he comes to life. Let's put him on the stage now, and again we've mocked up a little stage with some velvet curtains, and here comes Dennis to take a bow. Deservedly so.